The bright lights of the New York City skyline flickered through the large windows of a bustling television studio. Inside, the energy was electric, a mix of anticipation and nervous excitement filling the air. The set buzzed with activity as technicians adjusted cameras, sound engineers checked microphones, and producers whispered last-minute instructions to the host. This was no ordinary night. It was the kind of episode that could make headlines. Greg Gutfeld, a man known for his sharp wit and unapologetic style, sat in his chair behind the desk, reviewing notes for the show. His tie was slightly loosened, giving him an air of casual confidence. Greg wasn't just another late-night talk show host. He had built a reputation for tackling tough topics head-on, often mixing humor with biting commentary. Tonight, however, promised something different, a confrontation that might leave everyone talking. Across town, Jasmine Crockett was getting ready for her appearance on the show. A bold and outspoken politician, she had recently made waves during an interview when she mocked Karoline Leavitt, a young conservative commentator who had been gaining attention for her views. Jasmine's words were sharp and dismissive, labeling Karoline as out of touch and clueless. Her comments quickly spread across social media, dividing opinions and drawing both praise and criticism. But what Jasmine didn't expect was how far those remarks would travel, or who would take notice. Word of Jasmine's insult reached Greg almost immediately. He had watched the clip himself, shaking his head at her choice of words. While Greg didn't always agree with Karoline's views, he respected her ability to articulate them clearly, and more importantly, he believed that mocking someone personally instead of engaging with their ideas was lazy and unfair. For Greg, this wasn't just about defending Karoline, it was about calling out bad behavior wherever he saw it. As he flipped through his notes, he smiled to himself, knowing exactly how he planned to handle things tonight. Backstage, Jasmine arrived wearing a sleek black dress and heels, exuding confidence. She greeted the staff warmly but couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. Her team had warned her that Greg might bring up her comments about Karoline, but Jasmine brushed it off. She trusted her ability to think on her feet, and knew she could hold her own in any debate. Still, there was a faint unease in the pit of her stomach that she couldn't quite ignore. As the clock ticked closer to showtime, the audience began filing into the studio. The seats filled quickly, and soon the room was alive with chatter and laughter. People were excited. This was one of those nights where anything could happen. Cameras were positioned strategically around the stage, capturing every angle. Warm glow of the studio lights illuminated the set, creating an inviting atmosphere despite the tension brewing behind the scenes. Finally, the moment arrived. The opening music blared through the speakers, and the crowd erupted into applause. Greg walked onto the stage with his trademark grin, waving to the audience before taking his seat. He greeted everyone cheerfully, making a few jokes to lighten the mood. Then, turning serious for a brief moment, he introduced the guests for the evening. Alongside Jasmine were two other panelists. Linda Harper, a seasoned journalist with years of experience covering politics, and Ryan Mitchell, a comedian whose quick wit often stole the spotlight. When Greg introduced Jasmine, the audience clapped, politely, though a few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people recognized her name from recent news stories, while others simply waited to see what she would say. Jasmine took her place at the table, smiling confidently as if she owned the room. Linda and Ryan joined her, completing the lineup. The stage was now set for what promised to be an unforgettable conversation. Greg started the discussion with some light banter, asking each guest about their week and sharing a few humorous anecdotes. It was clear he wanted to ease everyone into the conversation before diving into heavier topics. But it didn't take long for him to steer the discussion toward the heart of the matter. With a sly smile, Greg turned to Jasmine and said, "So I have to ask, you've been making headlines lately for your comments about Karoline Leavitt. Care to share your thoughts?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. She leaned forward, her expression calm but determined. "Well, Greg, I think it's important to call things like they are," she began. "Karoline has a platform, sure, but sometimes she says things that don't seem grounded in reality. When I called her out of touch, I meant it in the sense that her perspective doesn't always align with everyday struggles. The audience reacted with mixed responses. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked skeptical. Greg listened intently, his expression neutral at first. Then, without missing a beat, he replied, "Interesting. So you're saying her ideas are wrong because she doesn't match your worldview?" His tone was casual, almost conversational, but there was an edge to his voice that hinted at what was coming next. Jasmine shrugged, trying to maintain her composure. Not necessarily wrong, but maybe not fully thought out. "Look, I respect anyone who wants to contribute to the conversation, but we also need to challenge ideas that don't hold up under scrutiny." Greg nodded slowly, pretending to consider her point. Then, with a smirk, he said, "Fair enough, but let me ask you this. If someone disagrees with you, does that automatically mean they're clueless? Or is it possible they just see things differently?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Jasmine faltered slightly. She hadn't expected Greg to push back so quickly. Recovering, she said, "Of course, disagreement doesn't mean someone is clueless. But when someone consistently avoids addressing real issues, it raises questions about their priorities." Ryan, sitting nearby, chuckled softly, earning a glare from Jasmine. Linda, ever the diplomat, tried to interject by asking Jasmine to clarify which specific issues she felt Karoline had overlooked. But Greg wasn't done yet. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he prepared his next move. "Well," Greg said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "it sounds like you're setting a pretty high bar for what counts as real issues. Are you sure you're not just dismissing perspectives that don't fit your narrative?" The audience murmured again, sensing the tension building between Greg and Jasmine. Jasmine opened her mouth to respond, but Greg cut her off smoothly. "Because here's the thing. If all we do is attack the messenger instead of engaging with the message, aren't we just shutting down dialogue altogether?" For the first time that evening, Jasmine seemed unsure of herself. She glanced at Linda, perhaps hoping for support, but the journalist merely raised an eyebrow, waiting to see how Jasmine would respond. Ryan, meanwhile, grinned widely, clearly, enjoying the spectacle unfolding before him. Greg pressed on, his tone shifting from playful to pointed. "Let's be honest. You made fun of Karoline, not because of what she said, but because of who she is. That's not debating. That's bullying. And if you want people to take you seriously, maybe you should focus less on tearing others down and more on building your own arguments." The audience erupted into applause, some cheering loudly while others remained silent, processing what they had just heard. Jasmine's face flushed red, but she forced a smile, determined not to let Greg rattle her completely. The battle lines had been drawn, and the first round clearly belonged to Greg. But the night was still young, and Jasmine wasn't about to give up without a fight. As the segment continued, the tension between Greg and Jasmine only grew thicker. Every word exchanged carried weight. Every glance spoke volumes. The audience hung on every sentence, captivated by the drama playing out in front of them. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of what would become one of the most talked-about episodes of the season. The tension in the studio was palpable as Greg Gutfeld leaned forward, his sharp eyes locked on Jasmine Crockett. The audience, still buzzing from his earlier comments, waited eagerly to see how Jasmine would respond. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before answering. Her voice came out calm but deliberate, each word carefully chosen. "Greg," she began, her tone measured. "I think you're mischaracterizing what I said. My issue isn't with Karoline as a person. It's with the ideas she represents. If those ideas don't align with reality, then yes, I'll call them out. That's not bullying, that's accountability." Her response drew scattered applause from parts of the audience, particularly those who agreed with her political stance. But Greg wasn't satisfied. He tilted his head slightly, his expression shifting from curious to skeptical. "Okay, let's break this down," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "You called her out of touch and clueless. Those aren't critiques of her ideas. They're attacks on her as a person. And here's the thing. If you want to challenge someone's ideas, fine, do it. Lay out your argument. But when you mock them instead of engaging, you're not debating, you're name-calling. Isn't that right?" Jasmine hesitated for a split. Second, just long enough for the audience to notice. She quickly recovered, leaning into the table as though ready to take control of the conversation again. Look, Greg, maybe my phrasing wasn't perfect, but at the end of the day, we need to hold people accountable when they say things that don't reflect the real world. It's not about personal attacks. It's about pointing out flaws in their arguments. Ryan Mitchell, sitting quietly until now, couldn't resist chiming in. Oh, come on, Jasmine, he said with a smirk, his tone light but pointed. You can't dress up name-calling as accountability. If you wanted to critique her ideas, why not do that instead of going straight for the jugular? The audience erupted into laughter, some clapping while others groaned. Jasmine shot Ryan a glare, clearly annoyed by his interruption. Linda Harper, ever the mediator, tried to steer the conversation back on track. Let's focus on the bigger picture here, she suggested gently. Whether it's about Karoline or anyone else, the real question is how we can have productive debates without resorting to personal attacks. But Greg wasn't ready to let the topic drop. He turned, back to Jasmine, his gaze unwavering. Linda makes a good point, but let's not dodge the issue. You've been pretty vocal about tearing down people whose views you disagree with. Does that really move the conversation forward? Or does it just create more division? Jasmine crossed her arms, her confidence wavering slightly under Greg's relentless questioning. I'm not trying to divide anyone, she insisted. I'm trying to highlight problems in the way certain issues are discussed. If I come across as harsh, it's because these topics matter. People's lives are at stake. Greg nodded, slowly, pretending to consider her words. Then, with a wry smile, he said, Sure, lives are at stake. But here's the catch. If all you do is tear others down, how does that help anyone? Are you solving the problem, or are you just making yourself feel better by putting others down? The audience murmured in agreement, many nodding along with Greg's observation. Jasmine shifted uncomfortably in her seat, realizing she was losing ground. She glanced at Linda again, perhaps hoping for support, but the journalist remained neutral, watching the exchange unfold with quiet interest. Ryan decided to throw another jab, unable to resist the opportunity. Honestly, Jasmine, he quipped, if I didn't know any better, I'd say you're just mad that Karoline gets more attention than you do. The crowd roared with laughter, and even Linda suppressed a grin. Jasmine's face flushed red, her composure cracking under the pressure. That's ridiculous, she snapped, her voice rising slightly. This has nothing to do with attention. This is about holding people accountable for spreading misinformation. If you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who's clueless. Greg raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by her defensive tone. Whoa, 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 he said, holding up a hand. Now you're calling us clueless? That's rich coming from someone who spent the last 5 minutes dodging questions. The audience cheered loudly, clearly enjoying the verbal sparring match. Jasmine clenched her jaw, visibly struggling to keep her cool. She knew she needed to regain control of the narrative, but every attempt seemed to dig her deeper into a hole. Desperate to change the subject, she turned to Linda. What do you think? She asked, hoping the journalist might offer some perspective, or at least shift the focus away from her. Linda hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I think both sides have valid points, she said diplomatically. On one hand, it's important to challenge ideas that seem unrealistic or harmful. On the other hand, personal attacks rarely lead to meaningful dialogue. The key is finding a balance between critique and respect. Her comment earned polite applause, but it did little to ease the tension. Greg seized the opportunity to drive his point home. Exactly, he said, turning back to Jasmine. Critique is fine, necessary even. But there's a difference between critiquing someone's ideas and mocking them personally. And based on what I've seen, you crossed that line. Jasmine opened her mouth to argue, but Greg cut her off smoothly. Let me ask you something else, he continued, his tone deceptively casual. Do you think mocking someone makes them more likely to listen to your side of the story, or does it just make them defensive and less willing to engage? For the first time that evening, Jasmine hesitated. She looked down at the table, avoiding eye contact as she thought about her answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. Maybe my approach wasn't perfect, she admitted reluctantly, but I stand by my belief that we need to challenge bad ideas wherever we find them. Greg nodded, his expression softening slightly. Fair enough. But here's the thing. Challenging bad ideas doesn't mean tearing people apart. If you want to inspire change, you have to meet people where they are, not alienate them before the conversation even starts. The audience erupted into applause, many standing to show their appreciation for Greg's closing remark. Jasmine forced a tight smile, clearly frustrated but unwilling to concede defeat entirely. Ryan leaned back in his chair, grinning ear to ear, while Linda offered a small, supportive nod to Jasmine. As the segment moved on to lighter topics, the tension in the room began to ease, but the damage had already been done. Jasmine's confident demeanor had been shaken, replaced by a mix of irritation and embarrassment. Meanwhile, Greg basked in the energy of the crowd, knowing he had delivered yet another memorable performance. Backstage after the show, Jasmine sat alone for a moment, replaying the conversation in her mind. She couldn't deny that Greg had landed several solid blows, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about her own tactics. While she still believed strongly in her cause, she couldn't help but wonder if there was a better way to communicate her message, one that didn't involve alienating potential allies. In the days that followed, clips of the heated exchange went viral online, sparking widespread discussion. Some praised Greg for holding Jasmine accountable, applauding his defense of respectful discourse. Others accused him of being overly aggressive, arguing that he had gone too far in his critique. Regardless of where people stood, one thing was clear. The showdown between Greg and Jasmine had captured the nation's attention, leaving everyone talking about the importance of civility in public debate. For Jasmine, the experience served as a wake-up call. Though humbled by the encounter, she resolved to approach future conversations with greater care and consideration. A lesson learned the hard way. And for Greg, it was another night well spent, proving once again why he was known as one of the sharpest voices in late-night television. The studio lights continued to shine brightly, but the mood on set had shifted. Jasmine Crockett sat stiffly in her chair, her earlier confidence now replaced by a mix of frustration and defensiveness. She glanced at the audience occasionally, searching for signs of support, but most people seemed more entertained than sympathetic. Greg Gutfeld, on the other hand, appeared completely at ease, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied smirk. Ryan Mitchell stifled a laugh beside him, while Linda Harper maintained her calm demeanor, observing the tension like a referee waiting for the next move. Greg decided to press further, sensing that Jasmine was beginning to crack under the pressure. "Let's talk about this idea of accountability," he said, his tone casual but probing. "You keep saying you're holding Karoline accountable, but what exactly are you holding her accountable for? Can you give us one specific example where she got something wrong?" Jasmine hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. She hadn't expected Greg to demand concrete evidence, and her mind raced as she tried to recall a specific instance. Finally, she spoke, her voice firmer than before. "Karoline has made statements about economic policies that don't reflect the struggles of working-class families. She talks about solutions that sound good on paper but wouldn't work in real life." Greg nodded slowly, pretending to consider her answer. Then, with a sly grin, he replied, "Okay, fair enough. But here's the thing. If her ideas are so bad, why not explain why they won't work instead of just calling her names?" "Wouldn't that be a better way to make your point?" The audience murmured in agreement, clearly siding with Greg's logic. Jasmine clenched her fists under the table, annoyed by how effortlessly he kept turning the conversation against her. She took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. "I did explain my reasoning during the interview," she insisted. "But sometimes you have to call out patterns of behavior. If someone consistently avoids addressing real-world issues, it's fair to question their credibility." Ryan leaned forward, unable to resist joining the fray. "Hold on a second," he interjected, his tone playful but pointed. "Are you saying Karoline never talks about real-world issues?" Because I've heard her discuss plenty of topics that affect everyday people. Or is it just that you don't like her conclusions? Jasmine turned to Ryan, her expression sharp. It's not about liking or disliking her conclusions. It's about whether those conclusions are based on facts. And if they're not, then yes, I'll call them out. Linda Harper finally stepped in, attempting to steer the conversation toward a more constructive path. Let's focus on the broader issue here, she suggested gently. Whether it's Karoline or anyone else, the challenge is finding ways to critique ideas without resorting to personal attacks. How do we strike that balance? Greg seized the opportunity to drive his point home. Exactly, he said, turning back to Jasmine. Critiquing ideas is essential. It's how we grow and improve. But when you attack someone personally, you shut down the conversation before it even begins. Isn't that counterproductive? Jasmine opened her mouth to respond, but Greg cut her off smoothly. Think about it this way, he continued, his voice calm but firm. If someone disagrees with you, does mocking them change their mind? Or does it just make them dig in their heels even harder? The audience erupted into applause, many nodding along with Greg's observation. Jasmine shifted uncomfortably in her seat, realizing she was losing ground. She glanced at Linda again, perhaps hoping for support, but the journalist remained neutral, watching the exchange unfold with quiet interest. Ryan decided to throw another jab, unable to resist the opportunity. Honestly, Jasmine, he quipped, if I didn't know any better, I'd say you're just mad that Karoline gets more attention than you do. The crowd roared with laughter, and even Linda suppressed a grin. Jasmine's face flushed red, her composure cracking under the pressure. That's ridiculous, she snapped, her voice rising slightly. This has nothing to do with attention. This is about holding people accountable for spreading misinformation. If you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who's clueless. Greg raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by her defensive tone. Whoa, 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 he said, holding up a hand. Now you're calling us clueless? That's rich coming from someone who spent the last 5 minutes dodging questions. The audience cheered loudly, clearly enjoying the verbal, sparring match. Jasmine clenched her jaw, visibly struggling to keep her cool. She knew she needed to regain control of the narrative, but every attempt seemed to dig her deeper into a hole. Desperate to change the subject, she turned to Linda. What do you think? She asked, hoping the journalist might offer some perspective, or at least shift the focus away from her. Linda hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I think both sides have valid points, she said diplomatically. On one hand, it's important to challenge ideas that seem unrealistic or harmful. On the other hand, personal attacks rarely lead to meaningful dialogue. The key is finding a balance between critique and respect. Her comment earned polite applause, but it did little to ease the tension. Greg seized the opportunity to drive his point home. Exactly, he said, turning back to Jasmine. Critique is fine, necessary even. But there's a difference between critiquing someone's ideas and mocking them personally. And based on what I've seen, you cross that line. Jasmine opened her mouth to argue, but Greg cut her off smoothly. Let me ask you something else, he continued, his tone deceptively casual. Do you think mocking someone makes them more likely to listen to your side of the story, or does it just make them defensive and less willing to engage? For the first time that evening, Jasmine hesitated. She looked down at the table, avoiding eye contact as she thought about her answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. Maybe my approach wasn't perfect, she admitted reluctantly, but I stand by my belief that we need to challenge bad ideas wherever we find them. Greg nodded, his expression softening slightly. Fair enough. But here's the thing. Challenging bad ideas doesn't mean tearing people apart. If you want to inspire change, you have to meet people where they are, not alienate them before the conversation even starts. The audience erupted into applause, many standing to show their appreciation for Greg's closing remark. Jasmine forced a tight smile, clearly frustrated but unwilling to concede defeat entirely. Ryan leaned back in his chair, grinning ear to ear, while Linda offered a small supportive nod to Jasmine. As the segment moved on to lighter topics, the tension in the room began to ease. but the damage had already been done. Jasmine's confident demeanor had been shaken, replaced by a mix of irritation and embarrassment. Meanwhile, Greg basked in the energy of the crowd, knowing he had delivered yet another memorable performance. Backstage after the show, Jasmine sat alone for a moment, replaying the conversation in her mind. She couldn't deny that Greg had landed several solid blows, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about her own tactics. While she still believed strongly in her cause, she couldn't help but wonder if there was a better way to communicate her message, one that didn't involve alienating potential allies. In the days that followed, clips of the heated exchange went viral online, sparking widespread discussion. Some praised Greg for holding Jasmine accountable, applauding his defense of respectful discourse. Others accused him of being overly aggressive, arguing that he had gone too far in his critique. Regardless of where people stood, one thing was clear. The showdown between Greg and Jasmine had captured the nation's attention, leaving everyone talking about the importance of civility in public debate. For Jasmine, the experience served as a wake-up call. Though humbled by the encounter, she resolved to approach future conversations with greater care and consideration, a lesson learned the hard way. And for Greg, it was another night well spent, proving once again why he was known as one of the sharpest voices in late-night television. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the conversation shifted gears, but the tension in the room lingered like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Jasmine Crockett sat quietly for a moment, her earlier bravado replaced by a cautious determination. She knew she had been cornered, but she wasn't ready to give up just yet. Instead, she decided to pivot, to change the narrative and try to take control of the situation. "Well?" Jasmine began, her voice steady despite the cracks showing beneath the surface. "Maybe my choice of words wasn't perfect, but I think it's important to focus on the bigger picture here. This isn't about personal attacks, it's about addressing dangerous ideas that can harm real people." Her attempt to redirect the conversation earned some polite applause from parts of the audience, but Greg Gutfeld wasn't about to let her off the hook so easily. He raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical, but patient. "Okay, fair enough," he said, leaning forward slightly. "But let's talk about this bigger picture you're referring to. What exactly are these dangerous ideas and how do they differ from honest disagreements?" Jasmine hesitated for a split second, then launched into an explanation. "For example, Karoline has talked about cutting funding for certain social programs, claiming it will encourage self-reliance. But what happens to families who rely on those programs to survive? That kind of thinking ignores the realities of poverty and inequality." Greg nodded thoughtfully, pretending to consider her point. Then, with a small smile, he replied, "All right, I see where you're coming from. But here's the thing. If you disagree with her policy ideas, why not explain why they won't work instead of attacking her personally? Wouldn't that be more effective?" The audience murmured in agreement, clearly siding with Greg once again. Jasmine clenched her hands under the table, frustrated by how effortlessly he kept steering the conversation back to her initial comments. She glanced at Linda Harper, hoping for some support, but the journalist remained neutral, watching the exchange unfold silently. Ryan Mitchell, ever the comedian, couldn't resist chiming in. "I mean, come on, Jasmine," he said with a grin, his tone light but pointed. "If your goal was to make people listen, calling someone clueless probably wasn't the best strategy. That's like trying to win friends by insulting their intelligence." The crowd erupted into laughter, and even Linda cracked a small smile. Jasmine shot Ryan a glare, her patience wearing thin. "This isn't about winning friends," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "It's about standing up for what's right, even if it means ruffling feathers." Greg leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but piercing. "Sure, standing up for what's right is important. But let me ask you this. If your goal is to inspire change, does tearing someone down help or hurt your cause? Doesn't it just create more division?" Jasmine opened her mouth to respond, but Greg continued before she could speak. "Think about it. If someone feels attacked, they're less likely to hear you out. They'll shut down, get defensive, and maybe even double down on their original position. So while you might feel good about calling them out,
Are you actually accomplishing anything meaningful? The audience clapped loudly, many nodding along with Greg's observation.
Jasmine shifted uncomfortably in her seat, realizing that every word he spoke only made her position weaker. She glanced around the table, searching for allies, but found none. Even Linda seemed content to let Greg dominate the discussion. Desperate. To regain some ground, Jasmine tried a different approach. "Look, I'm not saying we should sugarcoat everything," she said, her tone firm but measured. "Sometimes you have to call things like they are. If someone's ideas are harmful, we need to say so, loudly and clearly." Greg tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "I agree that honesty is important," he said slowly. "But there's a difference between being honest and being cruel. You can critique someone's ideas without resorting to insults. In fact, doing so makes your argument stronger, not weaker." Jasmine sighed, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on her. She knew he was right, but admitting it felt like surrender. Still, she forced herself to nod slightly, conceding the point. "Maybe my delivery could have been better," she admitted reluctantly. "But the underlying issue still stands. We can't afford to ignore policies that hurt vulnerable communities." Linda finally stepped in, sensing an opportunity to steer the conversation toward something more constructive. "That's a valid concern," she said gently, her voice soothing compared to the sharp exchanges that had dominated the discussion. "So, how do we address those issues in a way that brings people together rather than driving them apart?" Jasmine considered the question for a moment, her frustration giving way to reflection. "I think it starts with listening," she said, her tone softer now. "We need to understand where people are coming from, even if we don't agree with them. Only then can we find common ground and work toward solutions." Greg nodded approvingly, his earlier intensity giving way to a hint of satisfaction. "Exactly," he said, smiling faintly. "Listening is key, and when you critique someone's ideas, do it respectfully. That way you open the door to dialogue, instead of slamming it shut." The audience erupted into applause, many standing to show their appreciation for the shift in tone. For the first time that evening, Jasmine allowed herself a genuine smile, though it was tinged with humility. She realized that while she had lost this particular battle, she had gained something far more valuable, a lesson in how to communicate more effectively. As the segment wrapped up, Greg thanked Jasmine for joining the panel, his tone warm but tinged with irony. "Thanks for being such a great sport," he said with a grin, earning a few chuckles from the audience. Jasmine nodded politely, forcing herself to laugh along despite the lingering sting of defeat. Backstage after the show, Jasmine sat alone for a moment, replaying the conversation in her mind. She couldn't deny that Greg had bested her, but she also couldn't deny the truth in his words. Personal attacks might feel satisfying in the moment, but they rarely lead to meaningful change. If she wanted to make a real impact, she needed to focus on building bridges, not burning them. Meanwhile, Greg returned to his dressing room, already planning his opening monologue for the next episode. He knew tonight's showdown would generate plenty of buzz, and he was eager to capitalize on it. As he reviewed clips of the heated exchange, he smiled to himself, proud of how he had handled the situation. For him, it was another reminder of why he loved his job, the thrill of challenging bad behavior and sparking important conversations. In the days that followed, footage of the debate went viral, sparking widespread discussion online. Some praised Greg for holding Jasmine accountable, applauding his defense of respectful discourse. Others accused him of being overly harsh, arguing that he had gone too far in his critique. Regardless of where people stood, one thing was clear. The showdown between Greg and Jasmine had captured the nation's attention, leaving everyone talking about the importance of civility in public debate. For Jasmine, the experience served as a wake-up call. Though humbled by the encounter, she resolved to approach future debates with greater care and consideration, a lesson learned the hard way. And for Greg, it was another night well spent, proving once again why he was known as one of the sharpest voices in late-night television. The studio lights dimmed as the episode came to a close, but the energy in the room remained high. The audience was buzzing with excitement, their faces lit up with smiles and animated chatter. Greg Gutfeld leaned back in his chair, his trademark grin spreading across his face as he soaked in the applause. He had done what he always aimed to do, spark a conversation that mattered. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, sat quietly, her expression more subdued. She managed a polite smile for the cameras, but it was clear she was still processing everything that had happened. As the credits rolled and the cameras cut off, the atmosphere backstage shifted. The production crew moved quickly to dismantle equipment and prepare for the next show while the guests gathered their belongings. Jasmine lingered near the edge of the stage, taking deep breaths to steady herself. She felt a mix of emotions: frustration at how the conversation had gone, embarrassment over being called out so publicly, but also a strange sense of clarity. For all the heat she'd taken from Greg, she couldn't deny that his words had struck a nerve. Maybe there was truth in what he said. Linda Harper approached her, offering a kind smile. "That was quite the discussion," she said gently, her tone neutral but supportive. "You handled yourself well under pressure." Jasmine forced a small laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know about that. I think I walked right into a trap and didn't even realize it until it was too late." Linda nodded sympathetically. "It happens to everyone. But sometimes these moments teach us things we wouldn't have learned otherwise. Just take some time to reflect. It might help you grow." Jasmine appreciated the advice, though she wasn't ready to admit it fully yet. Instead, she thanked Linda and excused herself, heading toward the green room to gather her thoughts. As she walked, she replayed the conversation in her mind, cringing at certain moments where she knew she could have responded better. Her initial confidence now seemed reckless, and she wondered if she had let her emotions get the better of her. Meanwhile, Greg was already chatting with Ryan Mitchell and a few members of the production team, laughing about the night's events. "Did you see her face when I brought up accountability?" Greg said, grinning widely. "Priceless," Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "She didn't stand a chance against you tonight. You were relentless." Greg shrugged modestly, though his pride was evident. "Hey, I'm just doing my job. If someone steps onto this stage and says something controversial, they should expect to be challenged. Besides, I wasn't trying to embarrass her. I wanted to make a point, and he had succeeded." Clips of the heated exchange began circulating online almost immediately after the show ended. Social media platforms lit up with reactions, ranging from praise for Greg's sharp commentary to criticism of what some viewers saw as overly harsh tactics. Supporters of Karoline Leavitt flooded comment sections, thanking Greg for standing up for her. Others defended Jasmine, arguing that her intentions were noble even if her delivery missed the mark. Karoline herself weighed in later that evening, posting a brief message on her social media accounts. "I appreciate Greg Gutfeld for defending me tonight," she wrote. "But more importantly, I hope this sparks a conversation about how we can disagree respectfully without resorting to personal attacks. Constructive dialogue is key to moving forward." Her post received thousands of likes and shares, further fueling the debate. People dissected every line of the exchange, analyzing who had won and whether either side had truly made their case effectively. Some pointed out that while Greg had dismantled Jasmine's arguments, he hadn't offered much in terms of solutions. Others argued that Jasmine's passion for her cause was admirable, even if her approach needed work. By the next morning, the story had gained national attention. News outlets picked up on the viral clips, framing the confrontation as a microcosm of larger cultural divides. Pundits debated the merits of calling out bad ideas versus fostering open dialogue. Talk radio hosts dedicated entire segments to discussing whether public figures should prioritize civility over conviction. It seemed everyone had an opinion, and no two opinions were exactly alike. For Jasmine, the aftermath was both humbling and enlightening. Back at her office the following day, she found herself reflecting deeply on the experience. She replayed Greg's questions in her mind, particularly the ones that had left her struggling to respond. "Do you think mocking someone makes them more likely to listen to your side of the story?" His words echoed in her thoughts, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about her own behavior. Determined to turn the experience into a learning opportunity, Jasmine decided to reach out to a mentor, a seasoned politician named Karen Miller, who had decades of experience navigating difficult conversations. Over coffee, Jasmine shared her frustrations, admitting that she felt blindsided by Greg's critique. Karen listened patiently, nodding occasionally before offering her perspective. "You're passionate, and that's a good thing," she said. "But passion alone isn't enough. To inspire change, you need to connect with people, not alienate them. That means choosing your words carefully and focusing on ideas rather than personalities." Jasmine nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the advice. "I guess I got so caught up in making my point that I forgot about the bigger picture," she admitted. "I didn't mean to come across as dismissive or cruel, but I can see now why people interpreted it that way." Karen smiled warmly. "We've all been there. The important thing is that you're willing to learn from it. Next time, try leading with empathy. Ask questions instead of making accusations. Show people that you're listening, even if you don't agree with them. That's how you build trust." Encouraged by the conversation, Jasmine resolved to apply these lessons moving forward. She realized that being a strong advocate didn't mean tearing others down. It meant lifting ideas up through thoughtful, respectful engagement. Though it would take practice, she was determined to improve. As for Greg, he returned to his show the next night, ready to tackle whatever chaos came his way. During the opening monologue, he briefly referenced the previous night's debate, poking fun at himself for being such a bully. The audience laughed, knowing full well that his humor masked a deeper purpose: to challenge bad behavior and promote meaningful dialogue. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine noticed subtle changes in her approach. She became more mindful of her language, avoiding dismissive phrases like out of touch or clueless. When disagreements arose, she focused on asking questions rather than launching attacks. Slowly but surely, she began earning respect not just for her convictions but for her willingness to engage constructively. The showdown between Greg and Jasmine had sparked a ripple effect, inspiring discussions far beyond the confines of the television studio. While opinions remained divided, one thing was clear: the importance of civility and public discourse had never been more relevant. And for both Greg and Jasmine, the experience served as a reminder of the power of words, not just to challenge and provoke, but to educate, inspire, and unite.